Thank you so much. So I had wanted to share my screen so that you guys could follow what is essentially some reflections on the question of truth in psychoanalysis, and asking a question about whether at this current moment we're more paranoid, psychotic, or hysterical as a civilization. And it'll become clear to you as I kind of walk you through some of the quotations, but you can't see them because I can't share the screen, so you're just going to have to listen very closely. We did an investigation. We had a group in Das Unbehagen that wanted to read Freud's Constructions in Analysis and also Lacan's paper Science and Truth to get closer to the question of how psychoanalysis thinks of truth. So I want to read you a couple of quotes that I found fascinating. The first is from Freud. This is his late paper from 1938. He writes, "The transposing of material from a forgotten past onto the present or onto an expectation of the future is indeed a habitual occurrence in neurotics, no less than in psychotics. Just as our construction is only effective because it recovers a fragment of lost experience, so the delusion owes its convincing power to the element of historical truth which it inserts in the place of a rejected reality. In this way, a proposition which I originally asserted only of hysteria would apply also to delusions, namely that those who are subject to them are suffering from their own reminiscences." So what you hear that's so fascinating in this quotation is namely that he collapses the distinction between hysteria, psychosis, but also psychoanalytic interpretation itself. So just keep that in mind. This is Lacan on Science and Truth from 1965. He says, "Let us recall that Freud unties the knot in his discussion of the lack of the mother's penis, where the nature of the phallus is revealed. He tells us that the subject divides here regarding reality, seeing an abyss opening up here against which he protects himself with a phobia, and which he at the same time covers over with a surface upon which he erects a fetish. That is, the existence of the penis as maintained, albeit displaced. Let us, on the one hand, extract the no from the no penis to be bracketed out and transfer it to the no knowledge that is the hesitation step of neurosis. Let us, on the other hand, recognize the subject's efficacy in the nomon that he erects, a nomon that constantly indicates truth's sight to him. What it reveals is that the phallus itself is nothing but the site of lack it indicates in the subject. This is the same index that directs me to the path along which I want to proceed this year, that is the path you yourselves shy away from as you are called forth as analysts in the lack." So again, what I wanted to do in comparing these two quotes is that you see in Lacan as well that the kind of neurotic phenomena of denying the difference between the sexes, something that can become quite psychotic insofar as it's a complete rejection of reality, points again to the place where the analyst needs to interpret, right? Where he says we're called forth as analysts in the lack. All right, so are we at this point in history more paranoid, psychotic, or more hysterical? Perhaps given these quotes that this is the wrong question, especially since we are here to, seeing the distinction which is collapsing. Lacan says that given the extremity of the splitting of the ego, yes, I know a woman doesn't have a penis, but yes, she also has a penis, or simply, I don't want to know anything about this penis that she doesn't have. We have to look to this nomon not as the truth, but for the truth, namely the truth of lack. What interests me is that at this place where psychoanalysis tries to consider the question of truth or of knowing truth, there's always a question of sexual knowledge. Given that so much that's taking place right now seems to touch on questions of sexual knowledge, from the renewed war between the sexes in the form of incels, the idea of toxic masculinity, the return of white supremacy, Me Too and other gratuitous forms of sexual violence, pronoun and bathroom wars, conspiracies like QAnon, events surrounding Jeffrey Epstein displaced into Pizzagate, the pathetic righteousness of police union bosses, and even gender divisions within Black Lives Matter. For example, it took them a long time to recognize Breonna Taylor, changing the chant from say his name to say their names. Furthermore, in a book that's getting quite some attention recently by Justin Limiller, titled Tell Me What You Want, and I don't think that this person is a psychoanalyst at all. I think he's more of like a kind of Kinsey report person. He interviews 4,000 Republicans and Democratic men, 4,000 Republican and Democratic men about their sexual fantasies, finds that Republican men overwhelmingly fantasize about being cuckolded, often by Black men. This, it is said to be, for them, the most emasculating thing that can happen, excuse me. And Democrats, on the other hand, fantasize about BDSM and other power plays and rough sex, speaking of the fact that transgression for them is transgression of the equity of power between men and women. I think to understand this sexual gendered arena of fantasies that fuel a rather unfortunate reality that we now live in, we have to look more closely at paranoia and hysteria and the question of psychoanalytic truth. Lacan, in Seminar 3 on Psychoses, says that what we have to understand about paranoid delusion is that it's also very, very close to what happens, for example, in hysteria as a paranoiac syndrome. So in hysteria, there's a kind of paranoiac syndrome that's close to paranoid delusion. Paranoid delusions, if we remember in Freud, take the form of the sentence, I a man, love him a man, in which the verb is negated, right? I don't love him, I hate him, which is then projected, he hates me, right? At which point we have the persecutory fantasy in full swing. But in fact, something like this takes place in the Dora case. Dora, when she slaps Herr K for coming onto her, and by the way, Dora reads like a Me Too narrative, right? Herr K says to her, my wife means nothing to me. At which point Lacan says that everything that happens to Dora is as if she replies to him in that moment, then what can you be to me? Lacan says that her paranoiac syndrome erupts at this place where she suddenly decides that her father is prostituting her to Herr K in exchange for maintaining his ambiguous relationships with Frau K. Dora herself says that she knows that this is an exaggeration. It's not exactly true. They might just be sort of incompetent, terrible people, but they're not necessarily prostituting her on purpose. But she can think of nothing else, including separating her father from his mistress and taking revenge on Herr K. What he says that we have to understand here is that the I love him, her father, and Herr K becomes something of a question for her. Do they hate me? In the same paranoiac vein, right? So truth in the case of paranoia, on the one hand, is not hidden as it is in neurosis. It's outside in the form of delusion. And the paranoia provides the elements for its own understanding and in essence becomes a question of understanding. Lacan says, what is the subject saying? Essentially at a certain point in his delusion, he's saying that there is meaning. What meaning he doesn't know, but it comes to be foregrounded, it asserts itself, and for him, it's all perfectly understandable. What does the paranoiac understand? He understands that he exists. In effect, Lacan says the he is multiplied, neutralized, emptied, and so it seems of subjectivity. The persecutory phenomena takes on the character of an indefinitely repeated sign, and the persecutor, to the extent that he is its support, is no longer anything more than the shadow of the persecutory object. I mean, I thought this was really fascinating because the idea is that the he, right, which is in the process, the he of I love him, that's being rejected and then projected outwards, is multiplied, neutralized, and emptied of all subjectivity. Lacan then returns to hysteria and he talks about the famous case of a male hysteric that involved a pregnancy fantasy. He says, quote, what is at issue for our subject is the question, what am I? Or am I? A relation of being, a fundamental signifier. It is to the extent that this question was aroused as symbolic and not as imaginary, as it is for the psychotic, that the decompensation of his neurosis was triggered and his symptom became organized. Whatever their qualities, their nature, the material from which they are borrowed, his symptoms have the value of being a formulation, a reformulation, or even an insistence of this question. It turns out that the question for the patient that Freud was talking about was the question, what is procreation? Can I procreate? What am I as a man? Am I someone who can procreate? The Freudian topography shows that the obsessional or the hysteric use their ego in order to raise a question, which is also precisely not to raise it. So what is Dora, for example, asking in her hysterical question? She's asking, what is it to be a woman? But insofar as she complains about man or about men and develops a persecutory fantasy about them, she never really raises the question to herself of what her desire is as a woman. Lacan says she literally uses the penis as an imaginary instrument for apprehending what she hasn't succeeded in symbolizing. He says, and this is important, becoming a woman and wondering what a woman are very different things. I would go even further. It's because one doesn't become one that one wonders, and up to a point to wonder is contrary to becoming one. Right? So wondering then even may mean not even being able to become anything, because desire and one's desire and the questions of one's desire is completely sidelined. Why is this the case? Both for the neurotic and for the psychotic, something in the question regarding the symbolic is that in the symbolic, nothing explains creation, nothing explains life, nothing explains death, nothing explains sex or sex reproduction. The signifier is incapable of providing an answer to any of these questions. This is the real hinge of the difference, however, between psychosis and hysteria, where the aim of psychosis is to insist on meaning, whereas the neurotic, on the other hand, while they can get close to paranoia, to insisting on an answer to their questions, he's a toxic male, the answer, however, is only there as an insistence on the neurotic question itself. This, I would say, is the difference, but also at the same point where they're very, very close to one another. I'd like to conclude, just because I know we have very little time, to talk about what I would call this shadow. So if you remember the quote from Lacan, he says, it's at the place of the nomon, meaning the phallus, but also the sundial, the kind of the stick in the sundial. He says it produces a shadow, and it's always in the shadow that psychoanalysis asks a question about truth, namely where there is no truth, where we have to construct something. If we think about this shadow, I think that what he's saying is that this is where there's always the question of the return of the repressed. Today, we see this, for example, in the repetition of the phrase, I can't breathe, moving from a COVID reality to the question of Black Lives Matter, or, for example, in paranoid delusions, like about 5G, which on the one hand is going to open us to international surveillance and tampering. It's not going to give us COVID or COVID-like symptoms. Or even like Pizzagate, where it speaks to something like the reality of someone like Jeffrey Epstein, or even in hysterical affective contagion and unchained rage, for example, like in the Me Too movement and the rise of the incels. These phenomena point to a need for a kind of construction or reconstruction around a kernel of truth that is being symptomatically expressed, where the work that we have to do as a society, and here I'm very much in agreement with Todd McGowan, could mirror the work of analysis, not deconstructing truth, not shoring up values, but creating constructions or interpretations that address the place where truth had previously been rejected. I think we see this the most fruitfully in America with the history of Scotomized racist prejudice and continued inequality, which so many people are realizing how they didn't think about it. They knew it and they didn't know it. Fascinatingly, this question of the shadow is spoken of by Freud and Lacan with respect to each of the psychoanalytic diagnoses and also with respect to psychoanalysis itself. So melancholia, we know famously, is the shadow of the object falls on the ego. Paranoia, Lacan says, is that the subject disappears in the shadow of the persecutory object. The neurotic, the shadow of the question falls on the subject. And then very importantly, Freud says that in psychoanalysis, there is a shadow on the profession that comes in the form of an antisocial stain. I just want to read you this quote by Freud and I'll conclude. He says, if the ethical restrictions demanded by society play a part in the deprivation imposed on the patient, treatment can, after all, give him the courage or perhaps even a direct injunction to disregard those barriers and achieve satisfaction and recovery while forging the fulfillment of ideal that is exalted but so often not adhered to by society. He says the patient will thus become healthy by living a full life sexually. This, it is true, casts a shadow on all analytic treatment for not serving general morality. What is given to the individual, it will have taken from the community. If you look at this quote by Freud and you kind of condense it with what he's doing in Constructions on Analysis, there's something fascinating. There's a very fascinating movement. He's saying that by highlighting a rejected truth, constructing a form around it in order to express it, we return to civilization the truth that it refuses to recognize and give back to the individual the pleasure that civilization has stolen from them, especially in subjugating them to mass psychology, which degrades our ideals, which are so often not adhered to by society while it hypocritically exalts them. I mean, it's kind of amazing. It's a moment in which he really talks about what analysis does to civilization with respect to what civilization does to the individual, right? However, this requires the careful work of construction and reconstruction, not in an adherence to absolute fact or the dizziness of freedom from truth, but attention to the truths that have been rejected by society around the difficult questions of life, death, and sex. I'll stop there. Thank you.